Welcome to Who Runs This Park, Park Enthusiast segment, where we expand our universe and knowledge of experiences in the outdoors and at national parks through conversations with highly regarded and respected individuals in the outdoor world. As always, Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, exploration, and appreciation of our world's natural beauty. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Who Runs This Park, Park Enthusiast segment. Today, we get to hear the story of Joe Gibson, a trail builder, writer, and photographer who has dedicated his career to the craft and culture of trail work. Joe spent years shaping the landscapes of our public lands, leading crews, carving paths through rugged terrain, and ensuring that trails remain sustainable and accessible for future generations. His passion for this work led him to create Trail Cruise Stories, on which we'll focus most of our time today. Trail Cruise Stories is a project dedicated to sharing the voices, history, and techniques of trail workers across the country. He's also partnering with Mountaineers Books to create a book that documents the artistry and grit behind trail building. From his time with the National Park Service and Rocky Mountain Field Institute to his work with Parks Project and beyond, Joe's journey is a testament to the balance of labor, creativity, and storytelling. I'm beyond excited to dig into his experiences, both on the ground and behind the lens, and hear what he's learned about trails, teamwork, and the unseen world of those who build the paths we take and walk. Let's jump in. Joe, welcome to Who Runs This Park, Park Enthusiast Edition.
Thanks, Maddie. It's like to be here.
Yeah, a way many listeners know this at this point, a way I like to start the interviews is just by learning a crazy story about your time in the outdoors. So I'd love to hear, one of your crazier experiences you've had, whether it be while building trails or just on personal time outside.
Yeah, I guess I could say I've had the privilege of having a lot of crazy outdoor experiences and was trying to think of which one to share. And, I think one of my craziest experiences was actually outside of the US. Are you familiar with woofing?
Like the Knowles thing?
It's like a opportunity to
Oh,
work
yes.
on organic farms. It's an acronym, Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms.
Yes.
And it's a
Yeah.
great way to like travel very cheaply, especially internationally. And basically you can work on, usually it's some sort of farm. This story I'm about to tell, it was a sort of up and coming jungle ecotourism
Oh,
refuge in the Peruvian Amazon. And basically you work for 5 to 8 hours a day, and in exchange you get like room and board. So I was in college, I was traveling, and I found this place on the woofing site in Peru. I was in South America. I ended up out at this pretty remote jungle lodge that was still kind of being built, and it was basically just me, the caretaker, and these two other woofers who had just come out. They were from
wow.
Arizona, so a couple other Americans about the same age as me. And one of the tasks that we were assigned with was to survey the property line. So we teamed up with a couple of the local guys. There's a village of like 5 families down the street. So super remote. And mind you, this place is like 6 hour drive out of Cusco down a dirt road.
Wow.
Then
Wow.
you like hike in to get to the property. You had to like climb into this basket suspended over a river, like this raging torrent of a river, and kind of zip line yourself over this river in this little basket and then like hike a little further. So very remote. And basically to do this property surveying task, we were following these two or three local guys who were like hacking their way through the jungle, so completely off trail in some of the gnarliest terrain you can imagine, like extremely steep, extremely wet, so many biting insects
Oh my
and
gosh.
spiders, like spiders the size of dinner plates, like
Huh.
mosquitoes, ants that are like so big you can like hear them like clicking their jaws together. And so we're just getting absolutely annihilated by like bugs and this sort of thing. And we do this for several hours of like bushwhacking through this like horrendous terrain. And we like stop to take a break and like take some notes because we're running out like a tape reel, like a giant tape measure, trying to like do math and like measure out like where this property line is, draw a rough polygon of it. And we look up and our guides are gone. They're
Oh
just
my God.
gone. The only people who knew where we were and where we were going had just disappeared. And so we kind of are in a panic. It's me and these two other Americans, and then the caretaker guy. But the caretaker guy is actually not that like, he's Peruvian, but he's from Cusco. He's from the city. He's not actually that well versed in wilderness travel. And so what ensues is like a probably 6 hour just bushwhack, sufferfest, survival mission through the jungle, like trying
Oh
to get
my
back
god.
to this property, trying to figure out where we were. We basically just figured out that like, if we followed one tributary, we'd meet the main river. We follow the main river, we'd be able to find our way back. So we're like wading through these like muddy creeks that's like chest deep water. You can't see anything in there. And you're like
Oh
thinking
my
about
god.
all these Amazonian parasites and piranhas and sorts of things. And the sun is going down. We're like racing the sun going down. And eventually, like right as dusk is falling, we like make it back and we're just absolutely destroyed. We're like covered in bites and bruises and bleeding all over. And it turns out that the property owner had not paid those guys,
Oh my
and there was
gosh.
this like wage dispute. And so to enact revenge on the property owner, they intentionally abandoned us in the jungle. They probably had a good laugh watching us struggle our way back. But I think where I was going with this story is that we didn't have a trail, right? And I think that was like a very big experience of a trail isn't just a mechanism for fun, it's also like a survival tool,
Mhm.
and it's your lifeline back to wherever you're trying to go or civilization. And things can get really hairy when you don't have a trail. And
Yeah,
I learned that in a
very
very intense
quickly.
way.
That's insane. And it's like, how far would they have let you like spend a night in the Amazon? My guess is yes, based on them just leaving y'all. But that
Yeah,
is scary.
yeah. I had like fully prepared myself to spend the night out there. Like, and we didn't have food, we didn't have flashlights. It was like kind of cool. It was kind of like cloud forest type
Oh yeah, yeah.
jungle, and pretty temperate actually. But I was just the whole time, I was like, we're not going to die out here, but this is going to be a rough couple of days probably.
Well,
Um,
I feel like I'd freak out about, I don't know, the jungle's a whole nother level. Like I've recreated in the mountains and no bear safety and stuff like that, but I don't know, jaguar safety and it's just and yeah, all the bugs don't entice me.
yeah.
So I'm glad y'all found your way back and I like that you tied it to kind of just the value and importance of trails. How did you originally kind of fall in love with the outdoors?
Yeah, so I grew up in the suburbs in Virginia, kind of on the outer periphery of the DC suburbs. And there was like, a small little tract of woods behind my house that my parents kind of kept me on a long leash. And I just spent a lot of time like playing out there. And,
Yeah.
they tried to introduce me to like Boy Scouts and stuff, like more structured outdoor activities. And I'd never really enjoyed that. Like it always just felt too like the adults telling you what you can and can't do. And so I actually kind of, when I was younger, I gravitated towards things like skateboarding and like rollerblading and these sort of like independent activities that you could do without like adults looking over your shoulder. And it wasn't really until like high school when I got a car and could kind of get a little farther out of town that I got kind of reintroduced to the joy of just like hiking and
Yeah.
camping and realize that you don't have to go through this like structured institution of Boy Scouts to experience these places. And it felt like really liberating and fun. And then so when I was going into college, I just dove a lot more into it, started exploring more mountain biking and rock climbing. And I feel like I've tried just about every outdoor activity
Yeah.
at some point, and the different activities kind of ebb and flow with the years depending on where I'm living and how I'm feeling.
Yeah. It looks like you had a lot of experience with the outdoors at UVA. And I'll just say, like, personal anecdote of how I got introduced really to the outdoors was the University of Texas's outdoor program. And it was the first time I went backpacking. And so the minute I read that, I was like, oh, I'm excited to hear about, yeah, how you got involved. And it sounds like that was able to kind of fuel into flame your love furthermore for the outdoors.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was the most valuable experience I got out of college. I mean, way more than my academics. I'm kind of sorry to say, but college is so much more than academics, right? And one of the communities that I was able to get connected with was the outdoors club there, which is called Outdoors at UVA. Different universities do it differently, but at University of Virginia, the UVA is University of Virginia, I should say that. All the clubs are like entirely student run.
Hmm.
So they're almost run like kind of a small nonprofit, and you like request funds from the university. And as long as the club is like 51% students, you're good. So I got involved in some of the like administrative side of it as well, which also I think taught me more than any of my classes ever did. It was the biggest club at UVA at the time. I'm assuming it
Wow.
still is. It's probably like, I think it was like over 600 dues paying
Wow.
members. So huge club. I ended up being the president of the club for about a year and a half, which ironically I think like burned a lot of my time and actually probably kept me behind the computer more than going on some of the trips, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot about what it takes to like manage the logistics of an organization or like that, and just understanding how you can help people become leaders, outdoor leaders, and facilitate trips and just all the things that it takes to lead something as simple as a hike, and then things as complicated as like week-long trips to Moab. So it was a super valuable experience. And once again, like tying into the trails thing, we had some volunteer opportunities in the program where people would post, you can go do trail work or planting for a day. And that's how I got connected with my first trail work opportunity,
Mm,
was through the club. And I went out on this trail volunteer day it was just at a local county park. And I remember the supervisor, his name was Tucker Rollins. I'm talking to him and he's like, yeah, man, I've worked in Rocky Mountain National Park and Grand Canyon and all over the place. And you can just do this like as a job. You can just build trails. And I was like, what? Like,
yeah.
being from the suburbs in Virginia, like, I'd always been on trails, but it hadn't really occurred to me that like there were professional builders of them.
Yeah.
And, his assistant was this young gal, I forget her name, but I remember coming up to the volunteer day and she's just like hand sharpening a chainsaw on a picnic table and being like, that is cool as hell. Like,
Yeah.
that is
You're
so
like,
cool.
wait, what's
Um,
going on?
yeah. So like, I'm just immediately introduced to like the coolest people ever who seem like they've worked in the coolest places. And I was like, oh, this is cool. I kind of want to explore this more. And one thing led to another. And then I started doing trail work.
Yeah, I have a couple moments where I pull some quotes of things that you've written. And one thing is, I think you're a great writer. I just really like the way. And so I'll encourage listeners of just on Trail Crew Stories. He has a manifesto that's really beautifully written. But in one of your essays, I guess it was called Imagineering Cultural Landscapes, you write the following, and I'll read it just because I think it's a cool conversation topic and also just well written. But it says both Disneyland visitor and national park visitors are deceived about the landscapes into which they enter, while the Disneyland visitor is willfully and happily deceived. However, the national park visitor is more often than not oblivious to the subtle deceptions at hand. We trail builders play a key role in that deception as we engineer the paths from which most visitors view and experience a park. I guess you kind of mentioned this of like you had never thought about people, you've been on trails before, but had never thought about the people building them. And I think that's kind of part of it. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about that of just like, what is it like to create something that you almost don't want people thinking about who the creators were?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of follows the adage that like any good design is going to be mostly invisible,
Hmm.
right? Like if you have good user experience in a iPhone app, right? It's almost invisible. Like it just naturally flows the way you're trying. If you're trying to find something, you can just find it. You're
Yeah.
not like struggling to look through menus. Or if you're driving on the highway, like traffic engineering is like a very highly designed field that also incorporates all these things like human psychology in order to make driving as intuitive as possible so you can like focus on the road and your destination, and you're not really actively thinking that much about like the paint on the road or the colors of the signs, but all these things are like very intentional: the color of the paint, the color
Yeah.
of the signs, the size of the signs, the way they're pointing, which sign is on top of another. There's all these things that like are kind of invisible to most people unless you're really looking for them. And trails is very much the same way, where if you're succeeding in trails, people aren't paying attention to the trail itself, and the best trail work is invisible in this regard. But kind of on the back end, on the trail builder end, we're constantly thinking about that experience and how we can continue to cultivate that sense of, the trail has always been here. This is part of an organic part of the landscape, and keep people from looking at their feet and like looking up at the scenery. And there's a million little tricks we do to do that. But yeah, and it unfortunately it is self-defeating in some ways also, because
Yeah.
trails is something that is continuing to struggle with funding and recognition among pretty much all management jobs, especially right now. And so we sort of find ourselves in this funny situation where we're an invisible trade, an invisible craft, but we kind of have to make ourselves known to survive.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. And I guess that's a good segue into kind of talking about, is that in any way how you were inspired to start Trail Crew Stories?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's just not a lot of that information out there. Like there's
Hmm.
not a lot of written records of trail crews and trail work.
Yeah.
There's some memoirs that are written that are very good. Dirt work by it's on my bookshelf over there. I could go look. But Steel on Stone by Nathaniel Brody, another great memoir. There's like a small collection of memoirs, and some like building manuals have some kind of excerpts and quotes from people.
Yeah.
And there's some random kind of Park Service and Forest Service archival documents that have been written. But compared to a lot of other conservation topics, there's really not that much centralized documentation or history of trails. And a lot of it is sort of passed down just orally within trail crews
Yeah.
at a specific park or a national forest or a nonprofit. And it rarely really goes anywhere beyond it. And so as I was, getting into the world of trail work, working for different organizations and agencies and nonprofits, like you just meet the coolest people. And, it sort of just started as like, wow, like somebody should really just start writing this stuff down. Like, I don't think anybody's writing this stuff down. You meet some person and they tell you the most insane story you've ever heard. And you're like, have you ever like gotten that
Told anyone?
published or
Yeah.
yeah, written that down? And they're like, oh yeah, I don't know. I'll get around to it. And a lot of people who do trail work, they like it because they're off in the woods and they're not talking to people and they don't want the spotlight.
Yeah.
Right. So you have some people who are just the most fascinating, dedicated public servants you could ever imagine,
Mm,
but they don't really care about the spotlight and they don't have a ton of like initiative to like go out of their way to like write something down and get it published. But like
yeah.
they're willing to share if you're there to listen. And
Hmm.
so I think a lot of it was just sort of being in the community and starting to hear stories and being like, man, I should start just like recording these. And actually the the earliest iteration of Trail Crew Stories was just a print zine I made called Trail Crew Horror Stories,
Oh, whoa.
which was just a compilation of like people's worst experiences on a trail crew. Um, like when you're on what we call a backcountry hitch, is like your stint in the wilderness. Things always go wrong inevitably, and it ranges everything from like people getting severely injured to like you know poop related, a lot of poop stuff. Pooping in the woods is always right for horror stories. Animal attacks, like camps getting raided by animals. And so I just started asking people like what is the worst experience you've had on
Yeah.
on a hitch, and like started recording them and started transcribing them, and I made that zine. And a lot of people in the trails community seemed to like that, and I was like, you know what, maybe I should actually just get trail crew stories, not just horror stories, because people have
Yeah.
really great stories from this field as well. And so that sort of evolved into the kind of project it is now.
And what is a print zine?
So a zine is generally like a self-published, like little tiny magazine, basically.
Oh, okay.
Usually just printed on like 8.5 by 12 paper, folded in half.
Oh, cool.
There's a pretty vibrant community of zinesters.
Oh, I
You
love
know,
it.
a lot of local bookshops will like sell zines made by somebody, and they range everything from like pretty homemade, like just done at the copy shop, to like pretty professionally printed
Yeah.
little zines. But
Wow, that's cool. One thing I will say, and you and I have talked before, and I think it was right before I went to the North Cascades to film a documentary. And so listeners know about this of I spent 3 days and 2 nights in the backcountry with the chief of facilities of the North Cascades. And he chief of facilities, at least at North Cascades, I don't know if this is true at every national park, oversees the trail program. And he had a whole career, or has had a whole career in the trail world, and it blew my mind of just the like thought that goes into trail work. And I think you've mentioned this in some of your interviews and essays, but like also the level of technicality of the trail crew. It's like it's not necessarily this thing that one could just pick up, and there's this real like history and culture to it. And yeah, it's more so me affirming what you've done, and you've been working in it. And this is just as an outsider being like, wow, I got a tiny taste of it of spending that time with Bill and walking on the trail with him and him showing different things that like different features of the trail, or oh, they didn't put this on the side of the mountain, or just calling out, he's like always nitpicking trails because it's his life. And I'm sure that's similar for you. But one thing you said in a Mountain Gazette interview was trail work is about two things: getting water off trails and keeping people on trails. So I'd love to speak a little bit more about this and hear your thoughts on that.
yeah, I mean, I think trails are both a tool to mitigate erosion, but they're also the most susceptible thing to erosion.
Yeah.
And so, right, a trail exists for the land, not for the people. That's kind of a big thing that a lot of people don't really understand, is a trail is a sacrificial corridor, right? A good trail keeps people on it. and people will stay on it. And the reason you want
Hmm.
to keep people on it, because if you just have people wandering wherever they want to, they're going to create redundant trails that are all parallel to each other. That means they're trampling vegetation that you don't want trampled. They might be going places you don't want them to go. And so managing people is one of the first big goals of a trail, because if people aren't going to hike on your trail because it's not taking them to where they want to go, it's defeating its like singular purpose of
Right.
being that non-redundant singular sacrificial corridor. And there's a lot of like, methods to do that. I think a simple one I could touch on right now is what we call positive and negative control points. So a positive control point is somewhere that you think people are going to want to go. So if you're in Yosemite, Nevada, if you're designing the trail to Nevada Falls in 1860, Nevada Falls is a positive control point. That's like the destination where people are going to want to go. So if your trail doesn't go there, people are going to figure out their way there anyway, and
Yeah.
they're going to forge like what you call a social trail or a rogue trail. So you have to make sure your trail satisfies that desire of people through positive control points. There's also
Yeah.
negative control points, which are places you don't want people to go. And that could be, a hazardous location. It could be that there's actually a really rare plant species over there that you don't want people to
Mm.
get anywhere close to, or there's a rare herd of some sort of like ungulates that you want to steer clear of, or there's a sensitive archaeological site, or it could just be really bad soil that's like not good to build in, or like a
Yeah.
cliff that would be like impossible to build a trail on. So you're sort of like thinking, okay, where do people want to go? Where do we not want them to go? And that kind of ties back into that imagineering, social engineering aspect of trails. Is people don't realize, but like a trail is taking them where they want to go, but it's also preventing them from going places that you don't want them to go as a designer. So that's the people component. And the water component is sort of follows the people component, because once you make a trail, you've created essentially a path of least resistance for water, and
Mm.
water will destroy your trail faster than anything else. And so if your trail is too steep, it essentially just becomes a flow for water. And once that water starts scouring it out, it's going to become deeper and deeper and deeper until you just have this massive gully that will turn into a canyon, which
Whoa.
is not only, yeah, it's not only and I'm not even talking like Grand Canyon, like millions of years. I'm talking like if you have a bad trail and some heavy rain, all it can take is like 2 seasons of heavy rains to like scour a canyon. And a lot of it depends on the geology of the area, what the soil type is like. But in places like the desert Southwest, where you have this combination of these really intense monsoon rainstorms with like fairly loose desert soils, like something like that can happen extremely fast. Or like here in the Bay Area where I currently work, we have these big atmospheric rivers. We just had one come through yesterday. You have these big torrential, like seasonal storms that just dump for like weeks on end, and something like that can happen pretty quickly. So you have to think about how to get water off your trail,
Yeah.
and a lot of that comes into the design process. And there's all kinds of sort of drainage features you can build in. Um, and if you've hiked in the Northeast, you'd probably notice that a lot of trails go straight up the mountains, and that is, part of it. A big part of it is the legacy of the early kind of outdoor recreation culture out there, which kind of revolved around lodges and hotels that were built on mountains, and the owners wanting to provide like just quick access to the highest viewpoint. And also college hiking clubs actually had a huge role in early trail building in the Northeast.
Really?
Hmm. I think Dartmouth probably gets credit for being like the oldest running college outing club, is what they call it. But they built a
Wow.
lot of early trails in the Northeast. But a lot of those college students were just like hacking straight up a mountain, not really with a lot of regard for erosion. And if you hike in the Northeast, a lot of those trails are super gullied out and steep.
Mm.
And they have a little bit of an advantage with the geology there. There's a lot more granite and like clay in the soil, so like it doesn't get eroded quite as easily. But it's a pretty different hiking experience than the like nice meandering switchbacks that we have in the Western United States that have been designed around water management and also around pack stock and mining and horses.
Okay, I have two things that it's so interesting to learn some more of the history of that. And I have two things that it made me think of. One is recently I learned that there's you kind of mentioned this or alluded to it, that there's little like houses along the Appalachian Trail or along the Northeast that you can stay in it within the mountains. And I honestly only thought that was in Europe because that has been my only experience. So I don't know if you're familiar with those. They're like with the Appalachian Trail Conservation Organization or something. There's these summer houses you can stay in.
Yeah, I mean, along the AT, there's the shelters, which are like really simple, like three-sided sheds. But then there's some like lodges and
Yeah.
that have a lot more facilities. There was one actually pretty close to where I grew up, Bears Den, which was like a popular kind of Appalachian Trail resupply hangout
Cool.
spot. And I'm sure there's a lot more in the Northeast. The Adirondack Mountains also have some backcountry lodges that are
Mm,
resupplied by a lot of young folks who just backpack in all of the stuff on packs and pack boards. And some of the White Mountains, I think, also have some kind of these like historic backcountry
yeah.
lodges that are all resupplied like that same way.
Yeah, that's cool. And then is that kind of, I've heard between the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail, like the Pacific Crest Trail is, I don't know if easier is the right word, but like in terms of a more gradual grade on the trails. And is that because of what you're talking about? Of Appalachian Trail is more so straight up and down mountains versus like more gradual switchbacks on the PCT.
Yeah, so the Appalachian Trail has more average elevation gain per mile than the
Okay,
PCT. It's probably the simplest way to put it because the Appalachian Trail is like it's like 400 miles shorter than the PCT, but has like almost the same total elevation gain over its
which is so
length.
crazy.
Yeah, and a lot of that too is, when the Appalachian Trail was being designed by Benton McKay in the early 20th century, they were very limited by the property available, right? Because the East Coast is already like highly developed, and so they were sort of limited to these undeveloped ridge lines. And there's sort of a conception that your ridge line trail is going to be more mellow, but actually, if you look at a lot of ridge lines, they're pretty like roller coastery.
Yeah.
And so these sort of ridge running narrow trails that sort of just go like straight down to like each gully and back up
Wow.
in this like very roller coastering kind of style. I think it was a product of like one for one, just not having a ton of like the science of trail building was still pretty young at that point, at least recreational trail building, and also just the limitations of what property was available and just
Yeah.
trying to like hammer this ambitious project of the Appalachian Trail out quickly while the like political tides were in their favor. I think they
Yeah.
knew that if they dragged it on too long, it would probably never happen. So they were just
Yeah.
like trying to blast through it. But by the time the PCT was being built, there was a lot more thought to kind of the hiking experience, and a lot of things, more things had been learned. And a lot of it too is also they knew that they'd be using pack stock to uh, build the trail and to access the trail. And so if you have horses and mules, you can't really go above like probably like a 20% grade. Otherwise, a horse just isn't going to make it, especially if it's got like 200 pounds
Yeah.
of gear on it. So yeah, in the West, that explains a lot of the differences in hiking experience.
Yeah, that's cool. We've talked a little bit or a good amount about kind of just the technical aspect of the trail world and trail crew world, but I'd love to spend a little bit more time just talking about some of the aspects of the culture. And you've touched on it, but do you have any specific stories that have really stuck with you from interviewing such a wide variety of people?
Yeah, so I mean, I've met so many cool people. That's why I needed to check my notes because I was like,
Yeah.
which person did I want to shout out? And I wanted to shout out Loretta McLenny, who is recently retired Colorado 14ers trail planner. So
Oh, wow.
she planned the trails up. I want to say it's like 46 of
Wow.
the 14ers in Colorado. I think like there's like 54, and I think like two are on private. One is on private land. A couple are in the National Park Service at Rocky Mountain National Park, and pretty much all the rest are national forest. And pretty much all those Loretta planned. And she is one of those people who I met when I was working in Colorado, and she was planning some of the projects I was working on. And she just has the most incredible stories and has lived an insane life. And I was like, this is somebody needs to, you could write a whole book about Loretta
Yeah.
just herself. And I interviewed her for the Horror Stories project, and then I actually got to meet her again and interview her formally this past September when I was traveling back in Colorado. And it was like the day before her retirement. But she's just super badass. I mean, she has run the Leadville 100 race like a couple times. She's just, yeah, I think she's like in her late 60s, early 70s, and she is fast, like a fast, strong hiker. When I was checking out projects with her, like she would always be apologizing about going too slow, and I'd be like struggling to keep up with her.
Yeah.
And
You're
I'm
like,
like,
yeah, yeah, you're fine.
yeah, I'm
Like
like
hard
reasonable.
breathing.
Yeah, she's been struck by lightning, I think like 3 or 4 times.
Oh my God.
She's been the first responder on like at least one like major helicopter crash. She's, yeah, she's Pretty cool. And then like the last couple of years I was working with her, she had some back issues. And so the doctor was like, you shouldn't be wearing a heavy backpack. It's really bad for you. And she was like, but can I hike? And they're like, yeah, you can hike as long as you don't have a backpack. And she was like, okay. So she got the Forest Service to pay for a couple pack llamas that could follow her like up to camp. And she basically just like was dragging these llamas around all over the mountains to bring her gear. And then she set up camp with the llama toted gear, and then would go run out and do all of her like trail surveys and stuff. But she's just like unstoppable woman, right? Like she just like doctor was like, your back is broken. And she was like, I could figure out a way around this. Like there's a
Yeah, like
solution.
we'll make it work.
And she's like, I could retire, but I really want to plan these next few trails because I started the process and I want to see it through. So just, yeah, super admirable woman who is just dedicated to the land and the trails and pretty much didn't let herself have any excuses, and just really inspiring person for sure.
That's awesome. That's, I think, a good segue because I'm guessing you were interviewing her in September for your book, if that's
Mm-hmm.
correct. So, for folks who don't know, Joe got a book deal, I guess at this point, or last year, 2 years ago.
Yeah, I was like actually a little less than a year ago.
Oh, okay, so I guess
Mm-hmm.
last year, and you actually shared on Instagram. Well, first off, congratulations.
Thank you.
You shared on Instagram that before you had a website or an Instagram for Trail Crew Stories, your dream was actually to create a visually driven book celebrating the best of the best trail work and sharing the stories of the people who do it. So I'd love to learn a little bit about that vision and then that process of, what it's been like. I guess we'll jump into those questions of pitching for the book and then actually going on your trip. But going back to really first your vision of this book and what you originally wanted to do.
Yeah, like I mentioned, kind of the original genesis for Trail Crew Stories was this kind of goofy homemade zine of horror stories, and from that I was like, oh, maybe I should do one with like genuine stories. And kind of right around the same time I was doing this, I was doing some freelance work for Parks Project,
Hmm.
this California-based brand that does a lot of products all around national parks and supports national parks. I'm wearing one of their hats right now. But in between my seasons doing trail work in Colorado, those winters I was helping them out with a couple of different projects. One of which was a coffee table book celebrating national parks of the U.S. Called the Parklands. It was with this Berlin-based publisher called Gestalten, and I was sort of the project lead from the Parks Project side as
Cool.
far as helping them gather stories and fact check everything. And I was sort of sending them like write ups on each national park that then went to their team. And a copywriter sort of filled in all the gaps. And then, they had a whole photo sourcing team. I helped them, find photos and like NPS archives and that sort of thing.
Wow.
So it was very cool to see kind of how the sausage is made on a book like that. And I had
Yeah.
never been involved in a project like that. And I was having a lot of fun doing it. And I was like, okay, like this is really cool to see how this process works. And it's really not crazy complicated. I mean, I'm sure the actual publishing side of things is complicated, but as far as like getting the content and gathering the stories, it all of a sudden felt like, oh, this is actually fairly accessible. And
Yeah.
I was thinking like, maybe something like this book, like this beautiful coffee table book, why can we not do something like that for trail work? There's so much
Hmm.
cool trail work out there. And they always say like write the book that you want to read. And I
Yeah.
was like, I want to find a book that I could pick up and be like inspired to go to work every day and do trail work, or like get new ideas on how to build things and see the best of the best examples of trail work like all over the country, all over the world even. And so yeah, I started like just drafting a manuscript for a book basically, and sort of realized like maybe I should, the lower barrier to entry first step is set up social media, set up a website. It's like pretty affordable to do those things, and just kind of start there and then circle back to the book
Yeah.
idea. So yeah, I was like 2022, September 2022 or so. I like set up the website, set up the Instagram, and started just trying to like pump out a few blog posts to kind of put feelers out of like what do people like, what are people interested in, and all the while continue to work on this manuscript and kind of shop it around to different publishers.
Yeah. And my understanding is that it was quite a long process of pitching the idea and shopping it around. So what was that like, doing all that hard work and kind of having that stamina and then finally, getting to sign a deal?
Yeah, it was long in some ways. It was like, I don't know, 2 years of shopping that around. But like, I also feel really lucky because some people spend decades writing books and like never getting that email
Yeah.
back. And so I want to acknowledge that I'm very lucky, and ultimately like it was a fairly quick turnaround from like
Yeah.
project concept to like talking to a publisher. But there was like, yeah, this 2 year or so window of like once a month or so, I'd like put together a proposal, and every month I'd have to be updating the proposal with like, oh, these new photos I took, these new people I interviewed, always just continually dialing it in and just
Right.
a lot of time. So with nonfiction, I should say, for people who don't know, nonfiction, you write like a proposal with some sample chapters and an outline,
Oh,
and you
interesting.
send that out, and then a publisher says, oh yeah, this sounds good, we want to like fund this, like
Yeah.
here's how we think it should be different, and here's your timeline to finish it. So it's a little bit more collaborative, whereas for fiction, typically you have the full book from like start to finish. If you're writing a novel, you write the whole thing and then you shop that around, and there's a lot more work with agents in fiction, whereas
Yeah.
nonfiction, it can be a little bit more like you can kind of cold email these publishers. But yeah, I basically, what I do is I go to bookshops and look at books that caught my eye, and then look on the spine of the book and be like, who's this publisher? And I write it down, and then I'd go see if on their website I could find like a submissions.
Yeah.
And then I would just like kind of cold send these proposals to them. And a lot of them would be, if we don't hear back from you in 6 months, send a follow up. And so like the turnaround time is just crazy slow. And like, I mean,
Yeah.
I was still getting emails back from publishers like a few months ago being like, sorry, we're not interested. And I was like, I honestly forgot I emailed you.
Yeah. You're like, oh, thanks for the update, I guess.
Yeah, so it is a little disheartening, and a lot of the time, like you're just kind of like throwing these proposals like into the void, it feels
Yeah.
like. But and Mountaineers, the publisher I'm working with now, that ultimately like came together, I think, because it wasn't a cold send. I actually, through someone I'd worked with at Parks Project before, Alyssa Q, who's written a series of really awesome, like I guess rather edited and compiled these really awesome short story
Hmm.
compilations called Campfire Stories.
Oh, cool.
Her and her husband Dave have been doing those for a couple of years with Mountaineers books. And so I reached out to Alyssa and was like, hey, like trying to write a book. I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, can you like help me out a little bit? And we like,
Yeah.
had a couple phone calls, and she was like, oh, I should introduce you to my editor at Mountaineers Books. And so she connected me with Kate, the editor at Mountaineers. And Kate initially was like, yeah, I don't know if this is like quite ready yet, but like, I think you have something, keep working on it. Like,
Hmm.
come back to us when you have more. And so like 2 years later, I followed back up with them and was
No
like,
way.
here's what I have. Like, what do you think? And they were like, we love this. Let's get on a phone call soon.
Like,
I was like,
let's go.
pretty much.
That's cool.
Yeah. So there's definitely a bit of networking from previous jobs was key there.
Yeah, that's cool. Can you share a little bit about the road trip, which I'm assuming that you did last year, which I'm assuming was first of many potentially that you took for the book?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm keeping my day job as a trail worker for the National Park Service. So I'm really just trying to squeeze as much of this in as I can on my vacation time. And I have like
Yeah.
a 2 week furlough, like an unpaid mandatory furlough every year. So I linked that up with like pretty much the rest of my vacation and took 4 weeks off this summer, um, which felt like way too short, honestly, but did like a big road trip up through, or I should say, I live in the Bay Area for your listeners. So up from the Bay Area through Northern California, Eastern Oregon, out like just kind of shot across Idaho, then spent a couple weeks in Wyoming and Colorado and Arizona,
Mm,
and met up with a bunch of trail crews kind of all over the place. Got to like join some on their hitches, got to
cool.
hitch out with the Shoshone National Forest North District Wilderness Crew, which is like one of the most remote wilderness areas in the continental United States.
Oh,
Got like one of the
really?
highest concentrations of grizzly bears. Went out to the Tetons, got to like spend a weekend with the crew up there. And then also got to see some of their front country work. And then I also just met up with some of the crews I used to work with in Colorado and some old
Cool.
contacts out there.
Is it a similar process in terms of how you conduct the interviews currently for Trail Cruise Stories, or is it a different angle for the book?
It's like pretty much the same. I think the book actually isn't going to have a ton of like one-on-one interviews. There's going to be
Yeah.
like profiles of a few, like one per chapter maybe, of
Yeah.
some person who's contributed to some topic that is relevant in that chapter. But, every interview I always learn something new about
Yeah.
something. It could just be like an offhand comment about, oh yeah, we work with this really interesting rhyolite rock type here that it like splits really weird and it's hard to build with. And some of those just like little nuggets of information I'm putting in the back of my mind, because like sometimes it's actually those random little offhand comments that end up, you see patterns in what like people are
Hmm.
sharing, and you can kind of put together the broader narrative. And honestly, the one-on-one interviews and portraits are really my favorite part of the project, even if that's not going to be the meat of the book. Just from a personal perspective, I love portrait photography,
Yeah.
and it's just really fun and inspiring to like just sit down with somebody for an hour or more and just ask them, why do you do this? Why
Yeah.
do you get out of your tent at 5 in the morning every morning to go destroy your body and um, do this really hard job for like pretty meager wages. Because like I said, the trail community is full of like very cool people, and so
Yeah.
just any opportunity to like meet more people in the community is always a joy for sure.
Do you envision trying to cover most of the US and any international for the book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to like I said, trying to squeeze in trips where I can while still being currently employed. And this summer, trying to make it out to like the Pacific Northwest and then also the Northeast.
Yeah.
It'd be awesome to squeeze in a Southeast trip if I can get there. So yeah, trying to show a good representation of the US. I think right now we're just focusing on domestic United States trail projects, maybe a little bit in Canada, but part of me is like really hoping that if this first book is successful, I can pitch a international trail work kind of
Oh,
sequel to
that'd
it
be
because
amazing.
there's some really cool stuff happening in other countries right now. Some really cool long distance trails being built, and in many ways, the science of trail building is something that has been like the US has really kind of spearheaded that, like
Hmm.
recreational trail building. And, obviously it's different in a place like Europe where a lot of these hiking routes are like old Roman roads. But there are places like Armenia and Georgia that they're building the Transcaucasian Trail out there.
Wow.
And they're using a lot of the techniques that have been developed and gleaned in the US. And they actually have a
Yeah.
partnership with the Forest Service. So the Forest Service has hosted folks from the Transcaucasian Trail to come out and like do
Wow.
workshops with them. So there's some really cool like international collaboration that at least was happening up till the latest administration. I'm pretty skeptical any of that will be happening in the next 4 years,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But there are definitely some really cool things happening like outside the United States in the world of trail building.
That's so cool. And I mean, what a joy to have a project that you're excited about, but then have the dreams of how it could grow. And it's like, it might not happen, but I think having that, I have that in my own ways for the documentary that I worked on and the podcast, and just, oh my gosh, if this goes well, then this could happen and that could happen. And so, at least for us dreamers, it's fun to have opportunities and ideas to dream about. So I'm hopeful that you get to do something internationally.
Thank you. Yeah.
One thing I do have to ask is do you have a favorite national park, or at least one that you like really cherish?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd probably be the Grand Canyon for a variety of reasons, and one of which it was like the first place kind of like out west that I ever visited, and it wasn't
Yeah.
until I was in college. My freshman year in college, I did a alternative spring break. It's like a service program where you can volunteer over your spring break, and I signed up for a trip to Grand Canyon. I'd never been west of like Ohio until
Oh,
then,
yeah.
and we jumped on a flight from DC to Vegas, got in the dark, got in like a rental van, drove in the dark to like the Virgin River Canyon outside of Vegas, and just like slept on the ground on the side of the freeway basically.
Oh my gosh.
Then like woke up and the sun was out, and I was like in this canyon. I'm in the bottom of this canyon, and I was just like totally gobsmacked, just being going from total darkness to like waking up in like that sort of just like western landscape. And we're like next to the freeway. I've driven past that same campsite many times now, and it's not the coolest place to camp, but it's like it is a stunning drive through the
Yeah.
canyon. But that was like a very exciting moment. And then from that morning waking up, we had another like full day of driving out to a section of the north rim of the Grand Canyon called Toroweep, which
Hmm.
is completely separate from the developed section of the North Rim. And to get to Toroweep, it's like a 90-mile drive down a dirt road that's
Wow.
pretty bad condition. And there's car camping on the rim, but it's so remote you need a backcountry permit. There's only like 7 sites or something. You have to bring all your own water, all your own
Wow.
food and everything. There's like nothing out there, but you're like perched right on the rim of the canyon, and it's just the most epic corner of the canyon, I think, just because it's so remote. There's this one park ranger, Todd Seliga. He's been out there for like probably like 40 years now. He's just an icon of Grand Canyon because he's just lived out in this super remote ranger station. I've been heard it called the most remote ranger station in the continental
Wow,
United States.
really?
Not fact check that, but I believe it. And so yeah, actually, and then I ended up leading that same alternative spring break trip the following year. So I went back out the following year. A couple of years later, I like spent Thanksgiving with Todd at the rim there. And
Wow.
then like that same year, I went to the south rim with my dad. And then I hiked to the bottom of the rim of the canyon this summer. And then I'm actually going back out there for the Park Service training in a couple of weeks, which I'm really excited about.
Cool.
So it's just a really special place, and it's just got an endless opportunities for exploring, especially below the rim of the canyon. And I just love deserts, and it's just like a truly awe-inspiring landscape. That's like I don't think I've seen any place in the world that's like dropped my jaw as much as
Yeah.
like standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon has.
Man. Yeah, we as a family, we were driving from my grandma lives in Phoenix, and we were driving from Phoenix to Colorado. And so we stopped by the Grand Canyon, but it was in the winter, and so we couldn't really see it and we didn't really get up to the edge. So it's like I haven't really experienced it, but just the way people talk about it of it truly being such an awe-inspiring place, I've got to go. And it's like how cool to have places in nature that literally make your jaw drop. Like it's just so magical. One thing kind of to wrap up, it was a part of your manifesto for Trail Cruise Stories. And I just want to leave people with this. And obviously, if you have more thoughts on it, but with regards to Trail Cruise Stories, you say, I hope to retain some of the nuance that would otherwise be lost in generalization. And so I just appreciate all the work that you're doing to lift up the nuance and the beauty in this culture and in this world. Yeah. And I've had a blast learning a little bit more about the trail world and your experience building it out and your book and all of that. So thanks for your time, Joe.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And it never really came up today, but today is a very weird time to be like a federal employee. And I have to watch my words here, but the Forest Service laid off 3,400 employees yesterday, most of them
Yesterday?
yesterday. And it seems likely that a similar culling of employees
Oh,
will happen with the Park Service today. Many of them will be trail workers. And so, yeah, the future of this profession, at least in the near future, is somewhat uncertain. And I would just ask your listeners appreciate a trail a little more next time they're out, and if you ever see a park ranger, tell them thanks, because it's a tough time to be
yeah.
working in public land right now.
Yeah, I think it's good to highlight that. That breaks my heart. Yeah, it's good to know what's going on for the people who like the whole idea of this project was to highlight everything that goes into maintaining and preserving our national parks and public lands. So I hope people can continue to do that.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of trails might be closed this summer, sadly.
Wow.
So write your if you're upset about it, write your congressperson.
Well, I'll look into making sure people can do that. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. And thank you for sharing that. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening today. If you like this podcast, please share the word. Who Runs This Park's success relies on you rating, reviewing, and sharing the word about the podcast with your friends. If you have an idea for someone you want me to interview for this new segment, send me an email at maddie@whoruntsthispark.com or DM me on Instagram @whoruntsthispark, and we'll make it happen. Thanks again. So thankful for listeners like you. See you next week.